Step forward.
Me? Your Grace?
Yes, you. The ugliest maid in this manor.
Did I do something wrong, sir?
That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out. No.
Dust tastes like copper when terror sets in. The Duke wanted a monster to clean his chambers. Someone so grotesque he wouldn't have to look at her. He got Hester, a girl buried in soot and secrets. But dirt eventually washes off, and what's underneath is far more dangerous. The stone floor of the servants' hall sapped the heat straight through the thin leather of Hester's boots. It was 5:30 in the morning, the air thick with the smell of boiling porridge and the sharp, alkaline sting of lye soap. Usually, when a nobleman demanded a lineup of the maids, there was a frantic pinching of cheeks. Spit was rubbed onto eyebrows to darken them. Bodices were subtly tugged down. Not today. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from a root vegetable, paced the line with a heavy limp. Her cane struck the flagstones in a jagged rhythm. Clack, drag, clack. "He wants the ugliest," she rasped, stopping to glare at a trembling scullery maid named Julia. Julia had the misfortune of possessing wide blue eyes and a dusting of freckles. "You." Back to the kitchens. "If His Grace sees a face that's symmetrical, he'll have my head." The order had trickled down from the upper floors an hour ago. Duke Conrad of Brierley had fired his 4th personal maid in a month. The first 3 had been planted by his political rivals to sift through his letters. The last one had simply tried to climb into his bed, wearing nothing but a bottle of cheap rosewater. Conrad, famously paranoid and aggressively cynical, had finally snapped. "Bring me a crone. Bring me a gargoyle. Bring me a woman so thoroughly punished by God that I don't have to worry about her batting her eyelashes at my guest list." Hester stood at the far end of the drafty corridor. Hester, at least, that was the name on the household ledger. She didn't need to pinch her cheeks or fix her posture. She had spent the last 2 years perfecting the art of repulsion. When a woman is running from a past that involves a burned-down estate and a dead magistrate, beauty is a liability. It gets her noticed. It gets her cornered in the pantry by the footman. It gets her remembered. So, Hester made herself a ghost. Worse, she made herself a stain. She hunched her shoulders, permanently compressing her spine until it ached with a dull, throbbing heat. She washed her hair with hard soap and rubbed bacon grease into the roots so it hung in lank, foul-smelling strings. She took the soot from the kitchen grates and patted it into the hollows of her cheeks and under her eyes, simulating the sunken, bruised look of the chronically ill. She wore a wool dress, 3 sizes too large, binding her chest with rough linen until drawing a full breath was impossible. She looked like a corpse that had been pulled from a river and left in the sun. It was miserable, uncomfortable work, but it kept her safe. Men looked away from her. They stepped aside in the halls. Disgust is a far better shield than armor. Boot steps echoed at the top of the stairs. Not the hurried, shuffling steps of a servant, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who owned the stone he walked on. The Duke descended. Hester kept her chin tucked to her collarbone, watching him through the greasy curtain of her hair. Conrad of Brierley did not look like the heroes in the penny dreadfuls the kitchen girls passed around. He looked exhausted. He wore a dark wool coat thrown hastily over a wrinkled linen shirt. The smell of stale brandy, expensive cigar smoke, and bitter coffee rolled off him in waves as he walked down the line. His jaw was shadowed with 3 days of stubble, and his eyes, a hard, flat gray, were bloodshot. He didn't inspect them like cattle at an auction. He looked at the maids like they were a problem he was forced to solve. He passed a girl with a severe underbite. He passed a woman twice his age with a scarred cheek. He didn't even pause. Then, he stopped in front of Hester. Her breath hitched, catching painfully against the tight linen bindings around her ribs. He stood close enough that she could hear the faint, wet rattle of a cough in his chest. His boots, polished black leather flecked with dried mud, were inches from her battered, blunt-toed shoes. "Look up," he said. His voice was gravelly, ruined by cheap liquor and shouting. She didn't want to. Her survival depended on the floor. But disobeying a direct order meant a beating, or worse, dismissal. She slowly tilted her head back. She let her mouth hang slightly slack, dulling her eyes to give off an air of vacant stupidity. Conrad stared at her. His nose wrinkled slightly. The smell of unwashed wool and rancid grease on her hair was doing its job. She watched a muscle feather in his jaw. He didn't look pitying. He looked profoundly irritated. "God above," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "Are you ill?" "No, Your Grace," Hester rasped. She pitched her voice low, scraping it against her throat to sound like a rusted hinge. "You look like you're actively rotting." A flare of hot, sharp indignity sparked in her chest. It was absurd. She had spent hours making herself look exactly this bad. Yet, hearing him say it out loud stung. It was a petty, human contradiction that she immediately squashed down. She said nothing. She just blinked at him, keeping her expression entirely blank. Conrad turned to Mrs. Gable. "This one. What is her name?" "Hester, Your Grace. But she's a bit slow, sir. And clumsy. The kitchens hardly tolerate her." "Perfect," Conrad said, not looking back at her. "She won't be reading my correspondence then. Have her scrub not too much, just enough so she doesn't carry the plague into my study. She starts in an hour." He turned and walked away. Mrs. Gable let out a long, whistling breath and glared at Hester. "You heard him, you wretched thing. Get a bucket." The Duke's private chambers were suffocating. While the rest of the manor was a damp, drafty tomb, Conrad's rooms were kept at a stifling heat. Heavy velvet curtains, smelling faintly of dust and old tobacco, sealed the tall windows shut. A massive fireplace dominated the far wall, roaring with logs that popped and spat embers onto the stone hearth. Hester knelt on that hearth, a stiff bristled brush in one hand and a bucket of gray, soapy water beside her. Sweat slicked her back, gluing the coarse wool of her dress to her skin. The heat was melting the grease in her hair, making her scalp itch furiously. She wanted nothing more than to drag her fingernails down her head, but Conrad was sitting directly behind her at his massive oak desk. The scratching of his quill was the only sound in the room, save for the crackle of the fire and the harsh scritch-scratch of her brush against the iron grate. She hated him already. He had spent the last 3 hours entirely ignoring her, which she normally preferred. But his messes were malicious. He didn't just drop ash. He ground it into the Persian rug with his heel. He didn't just finish a glass of wine. He left the sticky dregs on the polished mahogany tables without a coaster, daring the wood to warp. He was a man daring his environment to fight back, and she was the one forced to clean up the casualties. "Stop breathing so loudly," he said suddenly. Hester froze, her brush hovering over a blackened patch of iron. She hadn't realized she was panting. The linen binding around her chest, combined with the oppressive heat, was making her lightheaded. "Apologies, Your Grace," she mumbled, lowering her head and resuming her scrubbing, forcing her breaths through her nose. "It sounds like a dying horse is loose in my study," he added, flipping a heavy parchment page. Hester gripped the wooden handle of the brush until her knuckles turned white under the layer of soot. "You miserable, hungover bastard," she thought. But out loud, she said nothing. She just scrubbed harder, the alkaline soap biting into a split cuticle on her thumb. Time crawled. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked heavily. Her knees, bruised from the hard stone, screamed in protest. "Fetch the brandy," Conrad ordered. She pushed herself up, remembering to heavily favor her left leg. The fake limp was exhausting to maintain, pulling the muscles in her lower back out of alignment. She hobbled over to the sideboard, an ornate piece of furniture littered with half-empty decanters. She picked up a heavy crystal bottle and a glass, turning to carry them to his desk. As she turned, the toe of her boot caught the thick fringe of the Persian rug. It wasn't a fake stumble. The heavy boots she wore were a menace. She pitched forward. In a split second of pure instinct, her body abandoned the clumsy, slow-witted persona. The heavy crystal glass slipped from her hand. Instead of letting it shatter, her right hand shot out, catching it by the stem mere inches from the floor, while her left hand balanced the heavy decanter against her hip. She stabilized her footing with a sharp, athletic shift of her weight, entirely forgetting to limp. The room went dead silent. Hester stayed frozen in a half-crouch, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The copper taste of adrenaline flooded the back of her throat. She had moved too fast, too cleanly. Slowly, she straightened up, immediately slumping her shoulders back into their hunched posture and dragging her left leg. She set the decanter and the glass on his desk. Her hands were shaking. Conrad wasn't writing anymore. He was staring at her hands. More specifically, he was staring at her right wrist. In her frantic lunge to catch the glass, the oversized sleeve of her wool dress had ridden up past her elbow. She looked down. Below the thick layer of soot and grease, she diligently applied to her hands and neck. The skin of her forearm was exposed. It was pale, unblemished, and undeniably clean. It was the arm of a woman who had never worked a day in the fields, not the arm of a lifelong, scullery wretch. Hester violently yanked her sleeve down, taking a clumsy, stumbling step backward. "Sorry, Your Grace." "Tripped," she stammered, pouring the vacant stupidity back into her voice. Conrad didn't blink. He slowly leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His bloodshot eyes drifted from her wrists up to her face, tracing the exaggerated hunch of her shoulders, the lank hair, the smudged cheeks. "You caught that glass," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "That. Just lucky, sir. Me mum always said I had hands like a rat trap, quick to snap." The lie tasted like ash. It was too folksy, too forced. Conrad stood up. He was taller than she gave him credit for, broad-shouldered and imposing when he wasn't hunched over a desk. He walked around the heavy oak furniture, closing the distance between them. Hester forced herself to stand her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to bolt for the heavy oak door. He stopped directly in front of her. The smell of brandy and sweat was overpowering now, mixed with the metallic tang of ink from his fingers. "Hold out your hands." "Your Grace, I need to finish the..." "Hold them out. Now." The gravel in his voice hardened into a stone edge. She slowly raised her hands, keeping the palms down, showing him the cracked nails, the soot, the ugly red rash from the lye soap. She made them tremble slightly. Conrad didn't look at her fingers. He reached out. She flinched, a genuine, violent jerk away from him. Her reaction wasn't acting. The sudden movement of a man's hand toward her brought a phantom stench of burning wood and gin to her nose, a visceral flashback that made her stomach heave. He paused, his hand hovering in the air. For a fraction of a second, the cynical cruelty in his eyes fractured, replaced by a sharp, calculating curiosity. He didn't grab her. Instead, using just his index finger and thumb, he pinched the frayed edge of her right sleeve and slowly pushed the rough wool up toward her elbow. The contrast was glaring. Grimy, blackened hands giving way to a slender, elegant forearm. He traced the line of dirt with his eyes, then looked back up at her face. He didn't look disgusted anymore. He looked like a man who had just found a locked box in an empty room. "You smell like a slaughterhouse, Hester," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fire. "You walk like a crippled mule. You look like a nightmare." He dropped her sleeve, stepping back. "But nobody with reflexes like a fencing master and the skin of a duchess belongs in my ash trap." He turned his back to her, walking to the window and pulling the velvet curtain back, just a fraction to look out at the gray, miserable rain. "Clean the glass," he ordered, his tone suddenly flat and dismissive again. "And tomorrow, don't bother with the limp. It's insulting to my intelligence." Hester dropped the limp. Walking normally should have been a relief, but it felt like stripping off a layer of armor. Without the exaggerated drag of her left leg, her gait was naturally quiet, measured, and light. It was the walk of a woman who had been taught to glide across ballrooms with a book balanced on her head, not a scullery maid who had spent her life hauling slop. Every silent step she took in the Duke's study felt like a confession. Conrad noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he didn't say a word. Instead, a quiet, psychological war began between them. It was a war of attrition, fought with beeswax, ashes, and silence. Conrad stopped grinding his cigars into the rug. He stopped leaving his brandy glasses on the edges of the mahogany tables. His messes became deliberate, calculated tests. Over the next 2 weeks, Hester found his little traps scattered throughout the room. The silver sovereign, tucked halfway under the heavy brass leg of his reading chair. A real maid, destitute and hungry, would have pocketed it, or at least hesitated. Hester swept it into the dustpan with the dead flies and dumped it into the hall bin without breaking rhythm. The unsealed letter, a missive, bearing the royal crest, left open on his desk, while he conveniently stepped out for a long smoke. She dusted around it, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the brass inkwell, breathing through her mouth to avoid the scent of the expensive sealing wax. The French novel, a battered copy of Voltaire, left open on the settee. When he walked in, she was scrubbing the baseboards beneath it. He casually asked her, in flawless, rapid-fire French, if the weather was turning. She blinked at him, let her jaw hang slack, and asked him if he wanted her to fetch the coal scuttle. He was looking for the spy. He was looking for the assassin. He couldn't fathom that a woman would hide herself in filth just to survive. To men like Conrad, the world was a chessboard. People were either threats or assets. He didn't understand that some pieces just wanted to fall off the board entirely. The physical toll of her disguise was becoming unbearable. The summer heat was creeping into the stone bones of Brierley Manor. Her wool dress felt like a cage of nettles. The rough linen binding her chest was rubbing her skin raw, leaving weeping blisters over her ribs. She constantly smelled of rancid bacon grease and stale soot. The lye soap she used on her hands was causing the skin to crack and bleed around the knuckles. One Tuesday afternoon, the sky bruised purple and black. The air pressure dropped so fast her ears popped. Conrad was at his desk, nursing a glass of watered-down whiskey, reviewing estate ledgers. Hester was polishing the brass fire irons. The first thunderclap didn't rumble. It tore the sky open. Crack. It sounded exactly like a dry timber roof beam snapping under the weight of fire. Her body reacted before her mind could intervene. The brass poker clattered against the stone hearth. Hester didn't just flinch. She dropped. She hit the floor hard, curling into a tight, trembling ball, her hands flying up to cover the back of her neck, her breathing inverted, turning into a series of jagged, high-pitched gasps. The heat, the smoke, the sound of the magistrate's boots on the burning floorboards. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the ceiling to cave in. The smell of burning pine from the fireplace suddenly morphed in her panicked brain into the stench of burning hair and roasting flesh. She was drowning in it. Hester. The voice was a low rumble, cutting through the roaring in her ears. Hester, open your eyes. She couldn't. She was trembling so violently, her teeth clicked together. A heavy, warm weight settled onto her shaking shoulders. It was Conrad's wool coat. It smelled of tobacco, rain, and a clean, sharp scent of cedar. It grounded her. The phantom smell of burning flesh receded, pushed away by the heavy, expensive wool. Hester slowly opened her eyes. The oak floorboards of the study came into focus. She was pressed against the side of his desk. Conrad was kneeling beside her. He hadn't touched her save for dropping the coat, but his large hands were resting flat on the floor, keeping a respectful, unthreatening distance. His flat gray eyes weren't looking at her with the calculating suspicion of a man hunting a spy. They were looking at her with the weary, profound recognition of a fellow soldier who had seen the trenches. "It's thunder," he said, his voice stripped of its usual gravelly sarcasm. It was quiet, steady, just thunder. "The roof is intact." Hester swallowed the copper taste of terror, slowly pushing herself up to a sitting position. She clutched his coat around her shoulders, shivering despite the stifling heat of the room. Her chest heaved against the tight linen bindings, her lungs screaming for oxygen they couldn't get. I apologize, Your Grace," she whispered. Her voice broke. She didn't sound like a slow-witted maid. She sounded like a terrified girl. Conrad watched her chest heave. He frowned, his gaze dropping to the high, rigid collar of her oversized dress. "You can't breathe," he observed. "I am fine," she lied, scrambling to get her feet under her. The room tilted violently. Black spots swarmed the edges of her vision. The adrenaline crash, combined with the lack of oxygen, was hitting her like a physical blow. "Sit down," he ordered, standing up and reaching for her arm. "No," she recoiled, throwing her weight backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the brass coal scuttle. The world flipped. She hit the floor again, the back of her head bouncing against the edge of the Persian rug. The black spots consumed her vision entirely, and the heavy, stifling heat of the study finally dragged her under. Consciousness didn't return gently. It hit her like a bucket of freezing well water. First came the cold, a biting, shocking dampness against her forehead. Then, the smell. The oppressive, greasy stench of rancid bacon fat and sharp lye was gone. In its place was the sterile scent of cold water, dust, and a faint undertone of lavender soap. And then came the terrifying realization. She could breathe. Hester's eyes snapped open. She was lying flat on her back on the leather settee. The heavy velvet curtains had been wrenched open, framing a bruised, rain-battered sky. She looked down. The top buttons of her oversized wool dress lay open. The thick, suffocating linen that had bound her ribs into a bruised cage was gone. It had been sliced cleanly down the middle and tossed onto the Persian rug. A silver letter opener gleamed dully beside the ruined fabric. Panic, sharp, cold, and entirely feral spiked through her chest. She bolted upright, scrambling backward until her spine slammed into the hard, tufted armrest. Her hands fumbled frantically, grabbing the edges of the heavy wool and dragging them shut across her collarbone. Conrad sat in a low wingback chair pulled close. He held a silver wash basin in his lap. The water inside was a murky, foul gray. In his right hand, he loosely gripped a wet linen cloth, stained black with chimney, soot. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, exposing the hollow of his throat. He didn't lunge to comfort her. He just sat there, watching her hyperventilate, letting the dirty cloth drip a steady plop, plop, plop into the basin. He was staring at her face. Slowly, Hester's trembling fingers reached up. She touched her cheek. The skin was raw, damp, and entirely bare. The gritty paste of ash and dirt was gone. She touched her hairline. The stiff, awful knots of grease had been rigorously scrubbed away. The grotesque mask she had painstakingly built over 2 agonizing years was currently floating as scum in the Duke's wash basin. "Who did you kill?" Conrad asked. The question struck her so hard, she forgot to inhale. I didn't," she stammered. Her voice, stripped of its rusted hinge disguise, sounded thin and terribly young. "Don't insult my intelligence, Hester," Conrad said, his voice terrifyingly flat. He tossed the ruined cloth into the water. It sank with a wet slap. A woman doesn't bury herself in ash and bind her ribs until they weep blood just to steal the silverware. She does it because a noose is waiting for her, and given the aristocratic bone structure you've been hiding under half a pound of soot, the person holding the rope has power. So, who did you kill? "I didn't kill anyone," she fired back. The lie tasted metallic. He burned. It was an accident. I just didn't unlock the door to let him out. The words tumbled out. The bone-deep exhaustion of carrying the secret finally fractured the dam. She slumped forward, digging the heels of her hands into her eyes. "Lord Arthur Pendleton," she whispered into her palms, the phantom memory of smoke stinging her nose. "He bought my father's debts. He came to collect, but he didn't want coin. He locked me in his study. He dropped his cigar near the velvet draperies when he tried to corner me. The fire caught fast. I grabbed the key from his desk, got out, and turned the lock from the outside." The study fell silent. The only sound was the violent drumming of the rain. She waited for him to call for the footman. She was too tired to run. Conrad leaned over and picked up his whiskey. He took a deliberate swallow. "Pendleton was a bloated, corrupt swine who skimmed from the royal treasury," Conrad said quietly. "I despised him." He stood up, grabbing the silver basin. He walked over to the stone fireplace and hauled the murky water directly onto the blazing logs. The fire hissed violently, sending up a thick plume of white steam that smelled of lye. He turned back, casually wiping his hands on a dry towel. "My previous maids were spies," Conrad said, his tone conversational. "They reported my movements to the men, actively trying to dismantle my political career. You, however, are a fugitive wanted for the death of a nobleman, which means you are the only person in this godforsaken manor who has as much to lose as I do. You can't betray me, because you can't survive walking into the authorities' line of sight." He walked behind his desk, picked up a heavy iron key resting beside his inkwell, and tossed it to her. She caught it out of the air, a clean, fast reflex. "Tomorrow, wash your hair. Properly," he said, walking toward the heavy oak door. "If you come into my study smelling like a butcher's floor again, I'll throw you out the window myself. Lock the door behind me. Get some sleep, Hester." He pulled the door shut until the latch clicked. Hester sat alone in the dim study. She looked down at the iron key in her palm. The metal was freezing, solid, and undeniably real. Slowly, she walked to the door and slid the key into the lock. The heavy thunk of the deadbolt sliding into the frame was the loudest sound she had heard in 2 years. She didn't feel hunted. She felt hidden, and, terrifyingly, she felt safe. Did the simmering tension and dark secrets of Hester and the Duke keep you captivated? If you loved this grounded, gritty take on historical romance, hit that like button and share this video with your fellow story lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter of our immersive audio dramas. What do you think Conrad will do next with a fugitive under his protection? Let us know in the comments below.